Motionless in White with Graveyard Shift. A few years ago, we spoke about their last album, and it was one that ended with enough curiosity where I was wondering where this band was heading next. They had a knack of writing some short songs that had some catchiness to it, but then it was really one of their longer cuts, a 7-minute long song that was what kind of attracted me back to this band, considering it showcased a group that was sampling something new that actually worked out fairly well. So here on Graveyard Shift we have 12 tracks, and if you remember, this is a band that initially started off more with a metalcore veneer. They fit within that core philosophy, but by now you can definitely notice that they have shifted over a little bit more to the industrial side, to the gothic side, and they have kind of taken on a bit of a different persona. So listening to this and hoping and praying for some of those elder scrolls of what Motionless in White have delivered is definitely one that could be met with a little bit of skepticism. In fact, whenever you hit up Rats, the very first cutoff of this album, you get something that sounds almost like it belongs in Marilyn Manson / orgy-soaked 1990s or early 2000s nu metal. It has that sort of feel to it. And there's enough of a catchiness to this that it's a little bit easy to sort of get trapped into this. It's a heavy track that has plenty to really keep you interested and awash within some throwback feel, but also has just enough of that sort of gothic / industrial beat to recognize where Motionless in White have kind of traveled to now within this stage of their career. Going into Queen for Queen and Necessary Evil, which features Jonathan Davis, you start to notice that some of these catchy little hooks are now becoming a bit of a prominent factor within their music. The Scranton-based product seems like they are aiming for a little bit of radio airplay, which they've gotten some in the past, but they certainly seem to want a little bit more. Necessary Evil certainly seems like it has a little bit of that bait based around Jonathan Davis's inclusion, but then you start to note some of the lyricism a little bit more, and that's where I think Motionless in White kind of goes a little bit overboard, and it's something that really holds them back quite a bit. In this song, you get the line, "It's my party and I'll die if I want to," which is a direct spoof, of course, "It's my party and I'll cry if I want to," which has no doubt been done by other bands before in the past. And initially, whenever you listen to this, it sounds extremely hokey, it sounds very bad, and almost dictates a little bit of a lacking of creativity. However, what is very interesting about this is that the beat that's behind it, the way in which it's presented, the way in which the phrasing really is able to mimic that classic track, somehow, someway stays in your head, and not in that classic phrasing, but instead in the phrasing that Motionless in White are able to offer with Jonathan Davis on this cut. But this is where the album has kind of reached part of its peak. You go to Soft and then into Untouchable and Not My Type, which is Dead as Fuck Part 2, and now some of the tricks are being exposed. You're starting to recognize what they're aiming to do. The ironic part about Soft is that it's probably one of the hardest cuts off of the album, one that is primed with a lot of aggression and perhaps showcases some of the band's prior veneer more prominently than any other track that is on Graveyard Shift. But based off of that, it's also one of the stronger efforts that is then sort of deleted a bit by what follows it, which are tracks that feel like they are really intentionally aiming to have a lot of offense or a lot of that grit based around it, almost as though the Motionless in White world needs to be centered around the dead and the fucking that goes along with it. It's kind of insane and gets very tiring overly quickly. It's amazing to me, actually, whenever I hear some of this lyricism, that folks are able to really stick around some of these albums for as long as they do, because they do prime themselves with fantastic musicality. Some of the way in which these tracks are developed and the way in which they are constructed are unique enough to remind you of some of those old charm bands such as Orgy or Marilyn Manson, or I could even think of an old band that was on Jonathan Davis's label entitled Videodrone. And the whole thing comes together kind of nicely, but I guess where the charm of those bands remains and where Motionless in White kind of falls here on Graveyard Shift is in that the lyricism does not have that feeling of necessary erotica. It's instead one that feels like it's a little bit more toward the violent end, either that or a little bit more toward just trying to be overtly offensive or just overtly kind of gross. I mean, some of this stuff is just really, really bad whenever it comes to the lyrical front. And they continue to spoof songs later on in the process, which then kind of transforms that nice sort of spoof one day later from Necessary Evil, where you then hear a spoof of somebody that I used to know by Gautier later on in this disc, and it just comes off once again. It's really uninspired, and that these lyrics directly need to have some sort of updated, morphology into a monster of these old classic soft, very kind of maybe pseudo-romantic or pseudo-not-romantic tracks, whatever you want to call it, to have this monstrous, twin side that is just overtly, grotesque, and it does not work out nearly as well. You can get away probably with one or two of those, and that's probably even pushing it. And what ends up happening is that as Motionless in White's Graveyard Shift continues into its second half, you definitely see a little bit more of that variety start to splice in. You hear some of the metalcore start to come out, and you hear that merge with the industrial side, and you hear that gothic twinge also come out a little bit whenever the songs start to slow down a little bit or become a little bit more centered on not being as heavy as humanly possible or as industrial as perhaps a Ministry record or perhaps even Lindman with Skills with Pills. This is an album where the variety of music that you are gaining could be seen as positive or negative based solely around your feeling toward this band prior to starting Graveyard Shift. If you enjoyed a more focused side of Motionless in White, this could be seen as very off-putting and kind of confusing. It could be the witnessing of a band that is truthfully aiming to, at least on the musical side, be as creative as possible and showcase multiple sides. However, if you are a fan of them sort of expanding their repertoire, then this is going to be seen as a huge positive, showing the dynamisty that this band can possess, which means that they have a lot to offer on albums in the future. But again, and I cannot stress this enough, the lyricism is what really bogs this one down. It just does not feel like it has a lot to offer. It's just this attempt to try to be as heavy and as brutal or as grotesque or monstrous or whatever as possible, which could be the, it's the gimmick. I get it. It's not like I don't get that. It's not like a lot of people don't get it. But there is that point in time where the whole entire motif reaches overkill stages. And one of the biggest problems this album possesses is that it reaches that overkill state way too quick and then just continues and continues to beat the dead horse. And that really brings this down a lot. And that's the sad part, because I wanted to enjoy this album because musically speaking it does have a lot of great things to offer. Musically speaking it does have a terrific slab and a terrific mix based around it, but it's really difficult whenever you're being barraged with the same sort of dead horse lyricism. But that's kind of just the world that we live in. Is this necessarily going to floor you even if the lyricism was, perfect? No, not really. If lyricism was perfect, it'd probably just be like a 21 out of 30. But this is an album that, because of that lyricism, loses so many points. It goes from being a, very good album to being sort of just average, and it's because that is such a weak side. They are able to deliver a lot of catchy hooks and melodies, but again, I feel that that is mainly based around the construction as opposed to being the whole dynamic. Whenever it comes to remembering things off of this album, the biggest memory for me is the track that they do with John, is Necessary Evil. And that just tells me that John right now, thanks to the Serenity of Suffering and now some of his guest spots, is just on fire. But this is an album that now has transformed itself from a potential 20-something into a 14 out of 30. The lyricism is just really drab. It's a super-duper letdown and just drags this album down right along with it. And again, like I said, that's a real shame. And I know that that might seem like a really big nitpick option to really cause such a large grade score drop. But the thing of it is that part of enjoying a record especially if it's one that does have lyricism, is that that lyricism itself needs to not feel like it's bringing the real positive factors that surround it down. And that's exactly what it's doing. But I want to know what you guys think about Graveyard Shift by Motionless in White. What do you think these guys are going to be with their next record? Are they going to continue in this direction, or do you think that they're going to do what a lot of their peers are doing and maybe try to go back to their roots? Let me know that in the comments below as well. I'm CoverKiller Nation, and I'll talk to you next time.